Um, my name is Stefanski, and I am an artist who makes woven works using a variety of looms to produce both complex patterned cloth and abstract tapestries. I also hand render sculptural forms using basketry materials and techniques. I wool into yarn and I hand dye the materials that are used in all of my work. I study Jewish texts from a queer and feminist lens, and I create art inspired by Jewish ideas about mysticism, creation, cosmology, and divinity. I see my practice as reasserting living symbols that are within Jewish cultural and textual archives as constantly transforming processes of communal meaning making. This is a photograph of half of the installation of my solo show, And Before One, What Are You Counting?, which opened in August of 2021 at Rome Foundation. And it represents the first solo exhibition that's towards this thread of artistic inquiry that's primarily centered around studying Jewish mystical texts concerning creation and cosmology, such as Sefer Yetzirah, which literally translates to the Book of Creation. The title of the show, And Before One, What Are You Counting?, is a reference to a passage from Sefer Yetzirah, which references a notion of immanence, a concept of immanence, where the entire universe is divine. I like the reference within the title to counting in numbers as a show about primarily textile art, and also the title as the sort of enigmatic question that gestures towards something that is kind of ultimately mysterious and unknowable. So I think I'm going to talk about each of the individual works in the show, but I'll start by actually addressing the overall space itself and the blue color that's on the walls of the show. It was really important to me that we paint the space. I felt that blue was sort of the only color that the room could be. And I felt that the indigo colors would be really strengthened by choosing to make the walls that color. So I actually, once we chose this color, I did a little bit more reading after the show, kind of just thinking about color theory with light blue. And one of the really interesting things that I found was that the artist Felix Gonzalez Torres chose a very similar color for a lot of his work because he associated it with memory, this sort of past that could be revisited, but ultimately never really recovered. And I think about that kind of in relationship to the show as both and that we're attempting to transverse, but also time that's maybe collapsed and looped back on itself. We can go to the next slide. This is a woven dimensional form that's titled The Depth of the Beginning and the Depth of the End. This is one of 3 works that I made for the show that I view as a contribution to the realm of sculpture from the perspective of interlacement. Each form is unique. I sort of sketch and draw them and then shape the reed intuitively with water. The water makes the reed material pliable and able to be woven and shaped, which I just do with my hands as the structure of the piece. And upon completion, I dye the dimensional forms to this rich midnight blue color that you see here in a vat of indigo that I have been tending to in my studio for almost 3 years now. Each vessel that I create, I think, acts as a sort of container and non-container for empty space. I wanted to kind of create this space for that which is invisible, but also present. I will eventually weave a series of 10 of these pieces, which are inspired by some teachings concerning cosmology, specifically talking about the 10 Sephirot, or the hollow dimensions of the universe that comprise an architectural frame for creation. So the Sephirot are also written about as inscriptions of the void that divine creative force flows through. So for this particular vessel, I thought about the form of the hourglass as sort of this reference to time, although it's not meant to like represent an hourglass, but to reference it. And all of the dimensional forms that I've created have largely undulation, as they're both rotund and nimble in their composition. They're all curvilinear in some way, which is inspired by my research into kind of the physics of space-time. And what I learned is that space-time itself is described as being curvilinear or not straight. So I wanted to bring that into kind of my creation of these really kind of like mysterious explorations of these dimensions of the universe. I wanted to work with indigo for dyeing them because I sought the color as I think it's really the only color that evokes depths within like all cosmic creation or all cosmic directions, such as both the sea and the sky. And there's been a lot that's also been written about blue's relationship to desire and distance. Blue as kind of being associated with a sort of longing. I recently came across a quotation, I think Goethe, and he says that we are drawn after blue and that it does not advance towards us. So I really think about that sort of in relationship to the works in the show, and what they might be kind of implicitly communicating around how we are drawn to advance towards these mysterious ideas. And I guess I'll talk about indigo in the next slide. If you can move us to the next one. So this is another dimensional form that I created for the show that's titled Luck of Lux. The form of the basket reminded me of a water-bearing container, and was the inspiration for its name, which is a translation of the name of the brightest star in the constellation of Aquarius. So the name is derived from Arabic astronomical origins and is Sadalsud. And through making the piece, I actually dove a little bit deeper into Jewish ideas about astronomy. And I found that in sort of kind of medieval period, there was a Jewish astronomer named Abraham Bar-Hia, who created an extensive catalog of names of stars and constellations and categorizations in Hebrew, which he published under, well, the translation is in English, but calculations of the stellar motions. And also in his system, he named the star the same name, which is undertaken as a Hebrew transliteration of the Arabic word, Sadalsud. So I thought that that was actually quite beautiful, that he kept the name and sort of just translated it into another way that people could understand it. So this piece is also dyed in indigo, and I guess I'll just touch on indigo a little bit. It's very involved, so we can go deeper into it if folks have more specific questions or anything that they want to learn about. But I guess for me, what's important to share is that I work with the indigo plant from a place of really great humility and respect. I haven't been trained in any kind of traditional lineage of indigo dyeing, in which there are many and that are thousands of years old in tradition and wisdom. But I rather kind of discovered the process myself emergently through experimentation and just being in relationship with someone who offered to trade me the materials and kind of a crash course in how to get my vat started. So I feel kind of very lucky that I've been able to work with natural materials since then. It's important to me that I don't use harsh chemicals or things like that in my vat. So I feel like I was able to kind of receive a really good recipe to begin with and then kind of to continue using it. So again, I'm happy to go more into the technicality if folks are interested later, but we can move to the next slide. So this is a slide of all of the vessels together that were in the show, but I'll be talking specifically about the mouth of the well, which is the circular flat vessel that is in the foreground. The mouth of the well was inspired by a text from a book called Pirkei Avot, and it is a list of 10 mysterious teachings that were created on the eve of the first Sabbath at twilight. And one of those things is the mouth of the well. So I was interested in kind of engaging with the mouth of the well. And I began to kind of think about what this is sort of communicating spiritually and conceptually, and going back into kind of Jewish text to think about this. So what I found is that there are some Jewish teachings that state that because of the merit of Miriam, prophetess that you may recognize from the Torah, sister of Moses, the Israelites were given a well of water that accompanied them in 40 years after they liberated themselves from the Egyptians. So this source of water followed, like kind of miraculously appeared and then followed them throughout. So Miriam was kind of, as I was saying, a prophetess and spiritual leader, received direct communication from God, just like her brother, in stories in the Torah. And so I began to kind of think about Miriam and think about the role of women in kind of spiritual leadership roles. And something struck me as I was weaving this vessel, which is that if you were looking down into the vessel that was filled with water, it would be like gazing into a mirror. You would kind of see your own reflection, your own image reflected back to you. And upon doing further research, I discovered that in Exodus, there is also a mysterious verse that references women who hold copper mirrors at the door of the tent of meeting. So there is, based on scholarship and things that have been done around this verse, there's evidence to suggest that this could have signified a sacred role that women held within the spiritual community, perhaps one related to divinations, as mirrors in the ancient world and in the surrounding cultures associated with the Israelites would have potentially engaged in these practices as well. So I began to really kind of bring it all back together to think of this as being kind of the surface of the water and the mirror as this kind of door between worlds. So we can go to the next slide. This weaving is titled Void Mother Tehom, and it's one of the largest weavings and also indigo dyed works that I've ever made. It is 7.5 feet wide by 30 inches long, and the cloth is hand woven with resists that have been woven into the cloth as it was on the floor loom. So essentially, the cloth was woven with strings that were coming out of the sides of it, that once it was finished being woven, you pull on the strings so that the whole cloth scrunches into a smaller form. And then once the cloth is in that smaller form, you take it and dye it in the vat. So parts of the cloth are not being touched by the dye, which is where you see the undyed portions of the weaving. So the process to I may never dye something whole piece that size again. I think that was really what probably an indigo master would have told me at the beginning, to not do that, because the size of the piece makes it difficult to maintain both the calibration of the vat and just it's easier if you can work in smaller pieces and then put them together later. However, I was able to eventually achieve this color, and it took me about a year of dyeing in order a vat of indigo that was the size of a like 10 more gallon garbage can. So that's just a little bit of the process of creating this work. But I'll go back to kind of the reference in the title, which is the word tehom in the title is a reference to a primordial life-generating abyss of water that is present before all of creation in one Jewish creation cosmology. And the Shekhinah, which is the feminine indwelling presence of the divine, one way to sort of talk about it, first appears actually Jewish spiritual texts. So this is in Genesis in the Torah, as the breath of the living God, which hovers over the Tehom, this abyss of water, at the beginning of time. So I like to talk about the linkage between these kind of hidden and more unknown references to the divine feminine that I think we don't often get taught, and to kind of bring that linkage into both the imagery of this like kind of primordial life generating abyss of water, and then also the presence of the divine feminine at the same time. So we can go to the next slide, which is just a detail of the work, so you can see a little bit more closely the wave-like pattern across it. And we can go to the next slide, which is very intimately related to the concept of Tehom in the previous slide. This work is entitled Making Love to the Devouring Force, Tohu. And Tohu is kind of the counterpart to Tehom. It is, both were present before creation. And whereas Tehom is kind of the watery void, Tohu is kind of this primordial energetic void of like chaos and formlessness. So they were both present alongside of each other in this mythology of like, I guess, the universe prior to the creation of all of life. And I was interested in kind of creating something that had a sort of incessant composition that was almost like too much to visually process or look at, in order to kind of get at this idea of this like kind of constantly evolving formlessness and chaos. And what I found also, kind of through a process of like channeling and kind of working with this imagery as well, is that there's also relationship to and other images of the Shekhinah as also devouring force, that she's kind of this like all powerful entity that just like eats everything in sight, like mountains, rivers, planets. She's described as like having fingers that come out of a river to like grip the sides of the banks. So it's kind of this like monstrous form that I think is really cool and like makes a lot of sense to relate to the concept of Tohu for me as well. So next slide, please. So this is a close-up of the textile. I'll give kind of just like a little insight into how it's made. So for this style of weaving, it is possible to draft. So drafting is kind of a process of like creating the pattern for what you're going to make. It's kind of the like calculus or how you need to set up the loom in order to create the interaction between the warp and weft in order to create what you want to see visually. And it's possible to do this by hand, but for this work and for other works in this style, I actually use a computer program called Pixel Loom, where I'm able to kind of compile my research into different historical patterns. And I kind of look at patterns that have already been created and combine them and mess with them and change them until I create my own. And then the program is able to kind of generate the both the pattern of threading the heddles, which I can maybe explain later, but one necessary creating the weaving as you want it. And then the other part is in what order you press the foot pedals. So the program generates this, and then I'm able to sort of dress the loom with this information and create the weaving. So next slide, please. This is a much more simple process. This is tapestry weaving that was also present in the show as a part of a kind of group of two. So those pieces. And this is just done with plain weave. So you can hand weave it on a frame loom. And I approached this without planning it beforehand. So really my only rules for myself was to work with blue hand spun and indigo dyed yarn that I had, and to create holes and like slits in the structure. So I wanted to work with kind of this intentional disruption of the woven structure to form the hole and to kind of experiment with the possibilities and limitations of a tapestry itself. So that was kind of my formal reasons for wanting to do it. And then I also had kind of metaphysical reasons that I was sort of dealing with. This tapestry is called For This Generation and For All of the Generations. And that is because I realized that one of the things that I was kind of trying to process through creating this weaving was that I often find myself throughout my life placed into kind of these metaphysical circumstances that feel like they're more powerful than myself. I kind of find myself in them sort of without having asked for them. And one example of this was just receiving the dream that I had in my life for 10 years. So the same dream over and over again for 10 years. And within the dream, I'll sort of summarize it quickly. It is myself and a group of children, 10 children. And in the dream, I am an adult. And I'm not necessarily taking care of the children. We're kind of comrades. We're like equals in this circumstance. And we are dragging a body that needs to be put somewhere, essentially. And within the dream, we're always just dragging it, and we never find anywhere to lay the body to rest. So I began to kind of deal with this dream. And I think that was kind of the inspiration for the title, was that I realized that there was some kind of ancestral burden that was kind of asking to be relieved, and whatever like rip in this space-time continuum that was created needed to be intervened with and repaired in the psychic space. So I did that both within the weaving and then also through doing intentional dream work to intervene and actually finally complete the dream myself. So we can go to the next slide. This is just an installation photo of kind of the architecture of the space, which I think was such a fun and cool way that I could think about installing the show within Roman Susan, was like finding all of kind of like the perfect places to hang works on the wall. So the tapestries were kind of diagonal to one another, sort of in these different slightly recessed, yeah, maybe that's the word, like slightly recessed areas within, like how the tapestry looks in between the back door and the window, where it's been placed in the space. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a work titled Piercing the Firmament, and this is the counterpart to the previous tapestry. For this show, it was really important to me to have 7 works in it. So I created this tapestry as the 7th work to complete the body of work. And I wanted it to have the same rules as the first one, which was to be comprised of indigo yarn and woven improvisationally with holes. And so I kind of began and really had absolutely no idea where it was going, which I think was a positive thing for me to explore at that point in my practice. But as I kind of worked on it more, I began thinking about kind of the Hebrew word for heaven, which is shemayim, which the word mayim in Hebrew is water. So it kind of translates to sky water. And I began to kind of learn about it, like from that point, like kind of cosmology surrounding the sky as being created when water was separated from water. And some interpretations of this notion were that the firmament was kind of this dome that was sealed and held like the water above, like separate from the rest of creation below. And so I was kind of thinking about this and thinking firmament, and there's like this element of it that is of piercing it that's kind of like this creative chaos, but is also sort of a way of continuing this act of like witnessing this reality of like rupture and repair that I was kind of dealing with within the first tapestry. And something I learned that I think is also really beautiful was that there are some teachings that state that new interpretations of Torah, so anyone who creates an interpretation of Torah that is different from something we have heard before, creates a new firmament itself. So there's this idea that creating a new mystical interpretation of something also creates, like, has an intervention within the process of physical creation on this like metaphorical symbolic level. So I was really like excited by this expansion of sort of this like symbol of the firmament through that perspective as well. And let me see here. We can go to the next slide. This is a shot of the corner of the exhibition where I painted text on the wall. This is Hebrew script. The color of the paint is called Living Stream. And the blessing is a blessing that's written by Rabbi Jill Hammer that's created with language and imagery from the Sefer Yetzirah, which kind of describes the architecture of the cosmos. So I'll read it in Hebrew and then also in English. So the Hebrew is Oimek Rom v'Oimek Tachat, Oimek Mizrach v'Oimek Ma'arav, Oimek Sfon v'Oimek Da'arom, V'chihiel HaKodesh Me'akavan Be'emet Sa. And so the English translation of that is a depth of below, a depth of above, and a depth of below, a depth of east and a depth of west, a depth of north and a depth of south, and the holy shrine at the center. We can go to the next slide. This is an example of just the continuation of these series of dimensional forms that I've been making. Like I was saying, earlier in the presentation, or mentioning earlier, that my next goal for my practice is to have a show with 10 baskets all together in a space. And ideally, I would like them to be on some kind of specially created, slightly raised floating platform. So I've been really thinking about like kind of the bottom that the works sit on, and how that can also be a part of the presentation of the work, and contributing to kind of their like otherworldliness, their otherworldly quality. And I also want to continue to create other tapestries and weavings in kind of the technique of overshot, which is the kind of very complex pattern piece that we saw exploring the notion of tohu earlier in the presentation. And I'd like to also continue to explore beads. I would like to see if I can make a curtain of beads that will hang in a window and reflect light. So that's another idea that I'm kind of all playing with, that's all inspired by this further research ideas about cosmology and creation. So I'll sort of close us out. Oh, actually, well, I'll share the title of this because I think the title is really cool, actually. The title of this work is called What the Mouth Cannot See and the Ear Cannot Hear. And this piece is actually also a textual reference from Sefer Yetzirah, and the description within the text describes the creator, and they have stones that are being moved around in various different configurations, creating different houses and structures. And they're being combined infinitely, basically, until we can no longer comprehend, and we're kind of invited to contemplate infinity. And the instruction with which to contemplate infinity is to go and contemplate what the mouth cannot see and the ear cannot hear. So I just thought that that was really amazing, and is just, yeah, really poetic. So I'll close us out before we go to questions, with just maybe sharing like a little bit more about, I guess, some writing that I've done about what it means to be kind of a contemporary artist that works with interlacement and weaving, and like doing that in a fine art context, in terms of what it means for me specifically, and then also dealing with the broader context. I think it's really interesting, the point in my practice that I've come to in relationship to weaving, because I believe at the same time that it is both full of meaning and also not fundamentally or inherently anything at the same time. It's kind of like this nothingness and also like infinity at the same time. However, like I also believe and know, or it's just true, that the practice of weaving is like always informed and impacted by history and politics, and the weaver's own ancestry and identity, and kind of the conceptual intentions of the weaver themselves, who defines what it means to go to their studio and to weave. And I think that right now my practice is really exploring both the possibilities and boundaries and limitations of weaving. But one spiritual truth that I do hold in relation to my work is that time is a very potent energetic force field that weavers can drop into and become very acutely aware of. And I think that this gives us a possibility to understand time more from a standpoint of love, and to then be potentially more open to being healed by time as well. I think that this is such a good quote. It's like, so if you know about weaving, you know about Ani Albers, but I'm going to quote Ani Albers because I just think this is such an interesting way of talking about things. She once said that her weavings are not about anything in particular, but that they deal with considerations that one has when they are alone. And while I don't think that like it's necessarily true that all weavers are alone when they weave, but I do believe that when you weave, you will be confronted with yourself over and over and over again. And that it's a very courageous process as an artist to continue to return to the loom, and to invite it as a source of transformation. And so I'll kind of sum up, I guess, just talking about this notion of transformation. I think that the idea of returning as related to transformation was something that I've been writing about when I think about Jewish ideas about the notion of teshuvah, which is a very enormous concept, but I'll kind of briefly sum it up as a word that describes both the process of transformation and the transformation itself. So the word references returning back to a source of alignment and kind of a method of making right what was previously misaligned. And I think that the practice of weaving provides this opportunity to do this, and also to like fundamentally meditate on a relationship between multiplicity and oneness, as it's kind of inherent in the form itself. The whole that is comprised by the many, that are kind of undeniably and inherently interconnected together to create the final work of art. So, oh God, I'm so happy about how the timing of this worked out. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to take any questions and thoughts at this point. Thank you for listening. Kathy, did you raise your hand?
Just saying hello because I got the camera on. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Loving the vessels, all of them, and the indigo quality of the dye. So in person, they're very, very matte, right?
Yes, that's true. They are. They're kind of. I would describe them as kind of like coated in a way, like they're kind of coated with the dye. And yeah, they have a matte quality. And I would have noticed also is that the color, well, this is true for indigo in general, is that the color kind of shifts and changes and deepens over time as well. So they've not faded, but they have changed since the show.
I look forward to seeing the grouping of them.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. If anyone knows of anyone who wants to fund the creation of this platform that the works will sit on and has a big enough space for that to happen, please put them in touch with me.
And have you been making baskets for a long time as an art form?
Well, actually, I started making them for the show at Roman Susan. So those were the first 3 that I made, aside from like learning in a class. I actually took a class with, is a Zoom class with another artist, Studio Heron. They gave a basket weaving workshop through a, I think is Yucca Valley Material Lab. And they taught us to twine, do this other technique called 3-rod wale, which is where you use 3 basket reed as the weft at the same time. So you can create volume more quickly, which is the technique that I use with the baskets that I created for the show. And also like wicker, which is kind of like for baskets. So I took that class and learned those techniques. And then I was like, I need to go into the 3-dimensional for this show because I wanted to use the floor. And it was like, just worked. It just was, I was propelled by something and it arrived for the show. So I'm excited about that shift in my practice. Yeah, Mindy.
So I have a question about, okay, so is the opening, the mouth of the well, is that part of the 10 forms, or is that a sort of a separate piece?
That's a good question, because I kind of go back and forth about whether it's a part of the 10 forms or a separate piece. Because I think that maybe you're picking up on this like conceptually just listening to it, is that it has a different kind of source of cosmological origin than the other works. I think probably if I were to do 10 together, I would probably try to make 10 without it.
And so that kind of leads to my other question. So do you have in mind what the other forms, what the other 7 or 6 forms will be? And are they related to, it sort of seems like the form like this, the hourglass form, and the water, they are related to, like, the one is to water, and one seemed to me to be about some kind of rotation, spinning. I could have misheard that, or just projecting that onto it. But but how are you going to decide? How do you determine what the other forms are going to be? And are they related to, like, different forces?
That's a really good question. I think that when I kind of continue to embark upon the series, I think I'll sort of revisit considering doing more research into particular energies and like descriptions related to the Sefer Rote, and kind of allowing the work to generate from that place. But also I do kind of generate it somewhat intuitively just through drawing, and then kind of working with the material as I'm crafting it. So like, for example, the last work that I showed, where it has kind of the different ending at the top, it's kind of opens up and flattens out at the top. I was not expecting to end the piece in that way when I was making it, but there was just something about the way it was evolving where I was like, this is the only way that I can end it, because if I end it this other way, it's going to communicate something that's I'm not going for. So it's sort of, it's kind of like all of those things are happening at the same time is really like how I work on them.
That's so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mindy.
Thank you so much, Olive. I feel like I'm just so enchanted by this presentation and reminded of how amazing that work was in person, and also just really blown away by the images and like getting to see it in a different context, and just like really being able to stare at the water and the patterns and hearing you narrate these stories about them while I'm looking at them has just been so rich and exciting. And I'm just like very grateful that we had this experience of hosting your work. And I guess I feel like yeah, I mean, Eileen just mentioned something about the talks about the metaphysics, and I love the connections that you make between your study of the cosmological texts and like how you bring them to life. And I guess I'm curious about maybe like how you started that practice, and also if there, I guess it makes me wonder if there's kind of like a tradition of people trying to illustrate the same texts, or if you're like, I don't know, breaking new ground.
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely feel like I could, maybe one day I'll write a paper or something where I kind of trace like the history of really elaborate and like intricate Jewish art as a sort of indication of like devotion to the infinite. Because there's definitely like a lot of examples throughout history of not only like, you know, instructions for making sacred space at different points, but also ritual objects and other forms of just craftsmanship that are incredibly intricate, and the labor and the intricacy has the purpose of communing with like the sacred in that process. So I definitely see myself kind of as another person who's entering into that art history, and like really just like I mean, I think like devotional is like always the way that I talk about my work, and I feel like that's the case of both like devoting myself to the lineage and also to the process of making the work itself. I think maybe one like really good example that I could give of that is there's this, what is it called? It's basically a practice of making a print with microtext. So it's this practice of Jewish art making where maybe someone would be like illustrating, you know, say example would be like a story from the Torah, and the image of the story from the Torah is comprised of the words of the story itself. And those are all comprised of teeny tiny, like it's like teeny tiny letters that like make up the image. So like something like that, I feel like is a really good example of that sort of intensity of and layers of meaning and like history that is brought to the work.
Does it come to you in your experience of it as something that you're like kind of like a meditative thought, or a like a sound response, or like something that you're kind of like hearing, or like I guess like yeah, I'm just trying to kind of like contemplate your relationship with the word and how it yeah it like how it tangibly influences you.
Mm. Like when I study and kind of like how I like sort of how I know like what it is that I want to go deeper into. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good question, because I do feel like it's different for each time, and like sometimes I feel like I get chosen, like kind of like I was saying before, like it's not going to leave me alone until I sort of engage, or sometimes I feel like it's more of this circumstance where I'm like, oh, I read that and I know like immediately that I have to like make work about that. Like Tehom and Tohu, I was like obsessed with. Like when I first like read it, I was like, I need to figure out like what it would mean to like create work about these notions, and like to figure out also through that process like what things are hidden and attached that like I might not have initially seen if I didn't go through the process of like engaging with it to make it as a work. But I think like I definitely think that I kind of came to make this work through like my practice overall is kind of being this way of like dealing with sort of the philosophical like contradictions of living, and like a need to find like a greater spiritual truth like beyond that. So I feel that it's just one of my like very fundamental reasons for making work as an artist, but also just as a person, like trying to kind of survive and process like the existential reality that we're all sort of sharing at this moment in time.
Thank you.
I just saw a woman's vessels made of really thin coils, and vessel after vessel, she's sort of surrounded by them, and she calls them her prayer vessels.
Mm.
And that is, to go back to your question about meditation, and it's sort of, every pun intended, it's woven in the work, right? In both your wall pieces and your vessels, it's integral.
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that.
Olive, I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how this work sort of developed from earlier work or when we met you. I think we met you when you were doing different public performances. And I'm just curious, like, how that transition or transformation happened and how those things are related, if they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely kind of started to like touch on that. I think in kind of my last answer, like those concerns, I feel like were really like present in my performance work as kind of like the through line of just what I was kind of attempting to investigate and deal with. And I think also that like very honestly, I think for a part of my performance practice was also investigating this idea of like suffering, which I think is both like a political question and spiritual question. And one of my goals within kind of my live art and like performance art practice was to create experiences through live art where alienation was reduced and we could kind of recognize one another more through this process of empathy. And I think that like the process of doing that just kind of shifted over time. And I think my ways of answering the questions that I was asking no longer necessarily needed to involve like my body itself in front of people doing art. And I began to sort of just like shift into wanting to create artworks that had kind of the same level of material elaboration as my performances, because I was also making like huge installations that would like encompass entire rooms that the performances would happen in and really elaborate costumes and things like that. And so I think also the relationship between kind of creating those like atmospheres and then those performance works kind of having their own logic that are kind of internal. It's kind of like internally maintained, the logic of the performance through the score of how it happens and unfolds. And I think that that also kind of is definitely a part of my fiber work as well, in the way that I think about things, that there's kind of these systems and worlds that get activated throughout the process of making them. And I think also just, yeah, that I was attempting to address very political questions. And I've kind of come to learn that there also is no mysticism without politics. So I think that like the evolution of addressing it in this way, I feel is not different. It's the same continued, but like a different method.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Mindy.
Yeah, I really love hearing about you talk about this show. I'm so glad I got a chance to see it.
Thank you.
You know, and hearing you talk about it, it's just really remarkable. And one of the things I appreciate so much and I find so interesting is you talking about like you're shifting from like the wall, like you like why you made that shift from the wall to the forms. and in relationship to just trying to visualize just the description of these spaces that are so abstractly described.
Mhm.
And I really love that that moved you to another space. And I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you about about when you were speaking about rupture and repair in
Mhm.
relationship to sort of the tapestries.
Mhm.
Did the process of thinking about it, you doing the weavings and that concept in relationship to your dreams, do you feel that it had did it play a part in the dreams ending after 10 years?
Yes. So, well, one, thank you for that comment overall. I really appreciate you noticing that shift also between the wall and the floor. And I think too that like a really major part of needing to do that was the notion of wanting to create hollow space, um, like a container for hollow space, and to have that be something that the weavings were also able to do was really important to me. Um, and well, I was able to complete the dream. So I actually worked with a dream worker. Her name is Jessica Palmer, honestly amazing, a friend. I will give you her information if you want to like have a session with her, but we essentially did a process of kind of like being awake, but also going back into the dream. And I went back into the dream and we walked through it kind of together of like everything that was happening in the dream. And then when we got to the point where it would usually end, she was kind of like, well, what happens next? And I continued it forward. And what was really interesting also about the process was that I did not always know like what was going to happen next. Like I felt like in some ways that I was like controlling like the narrative of the dream, but also there were times when what was going to happen next to the dream just like appeared to me and I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting that to resolve in that way, but I guess that's the way it was going. Like at one point the body spontaneously combusted, which I was just like, okay, like I guess that's how that's getting resolved. But it was also a part of there was like a very beautiful kind of burial moment that was happening, but then something like that happened as well. But we were also able honestly to do some really important work also around like caring for the children in that space and like creating boundaries, like energetic and spiritual boundaries around like their participation, and like also healing kind of just them having to go through that process for so long. And once I was able to kind of tend to all of those sort of aspects of the dream, I did not have it again. I haven't had it since like 2019, which is when I think I did that process.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it was pretty
Same.
cool.
And it kind of the process helped you sort of like just sort of mourn properly something that was plaguing you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or it was like something that was plaguing me, but also even I'm like, I feel like this is something that was plaguing someone before me, if you catch what I'm saying. Like I was like, I feel like I'm like receiving something that I'm in relationship to, and it is me because I'm in relationship to it, but it also isn't me. So it was like, yeah, I felt like there was multiple levels of kind of intervention of just like being able to put down the burden that was being carried, whatever it happened to be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mindy. I think there's a Oh, there's an article in the chat. Oh, thank you, Kathy. I'm going to look at this. Oh, sorry. I think I
Hi.
might have just frozen for a second. Oh, hi, Juan. Sorry, I froze.
Thank you for the talk. It was really great. I had a quick question about like, I think a lot of your work is like very rich, right? And there's like all these different codings that are involved and things that I think, like you said, if people aren't super aware of the research, it's hard to know. But I think I really appreciate like the titles that you like use and how I'm kind of curious how, like in what ways do you decide how much context or how much like background you give, and how did you decide what's like something that like you keep to yourself, kind of like similar to like the idea of like the dream and like yeah, because I think of like a lot about this idea of like when I also create work, there are certain things that I just don't tell people, and I think like it's for myself, right? It's like like I said, it might be meditative or it might be healing to make the piece. And so maybe I'll talk very briefly about it, but like there are things that I keep for myself, and I'm kind of curious how like you kind of think about that, or how do you approach that when you're making your work, and like some of it is like healing, or it's like how you decide how much context to share and how do you like hold back. So yeah, just curious about that.
That's a great question. And that's definitely something that I think about a lot, because I feel that the tension that my work is like holding is to have that tension of not like oversharing or kind of like directing too much, like how someone perceives it. So I think abstraction for me is a really good strategy for that. And I think that that's something that has kind of occurred in my work naturally as a way to sort of create that necessary ambiguity and just complexity. But I think that I err towards like that you appreciated the titles and noticed them, because I definitely think that the titles help a lot with bringing like whatever it is that I'm dealing with into the work and allowing it to have some room there, and then creating like curiosity for that research to be engaged with further. Or, you know, the person might just read, you know, the sentence that I have explaining what the Hebrew means, or they might, you know, go deeper. But I think that like in like sort of the explanation of the work for the show, it's like I did not include like all of the details of what the dream was about and all of that like in the writing that was like in the exhibition. But like when I'm in this context, it's like, sure, why not? Because it's like we're going deeper into all of those like weird intellectual spaces, and that's kind of like what we're doing at this moment. But I'm trying to think about if there's been like a context where I was like, I really want it to feel like very private. And I think that like, because of how long each of the works take to make, I think that that allows me a certain level of like emotional privacy in that way that you're kind of describing, to where I have a lot of different ways to engage with it and work through it, to where I can kind of recognize like I had that moment for me, and then this is like the moment that I'm going to share like publicly. So I think that like the durational aspect helps with that. And I think I also try to let go of like the control of like how it's perceived. Like I definitely create a framework, and I don't feel like shy about offering that framework, because I think that like a part of what my studio is doing is like engaging with that like knowledge production and those ideas and bringing them into the public sphere. But also I'm like, if somebody doesn't want to go there, I'm happy if they're just hanging out and looking at the weaving and like feeling peaceful, you know, like something like that is an example. Thanks for that question. That's a great question.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it.